My name isn't Derek, let me be clear about that from the start. I'm using that name because what I'm about to tell you involves people, or maybe I should say organizations, with a level of reach I didn't fully understand until it was too late. These are people who knew my GPS coordinates at 3 in the morning, knew what websites I visited from my home router, and knew the name of my daughter's elementary school without me ever giving it to them. They mentioned all three of those things in a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes. That was enough for me. I've been driving long-haul trucks for 11 years. I'm an owner-operator, which means I own my rig outright, a 2015 Freightliner Cascadia that I've put over 800,000 miles on, and that I maintain the way most men maintain their relationship with their firstborn child. I work primarily out of the Gulf Coast corridor, running routes between Louisiana, Texas, and occasionally into Mississippi and Alabama. I know these roads the way most people know their own neighborhood, every construction bottleneck, every chicken hawk hiding behind a bridge, and every truck stop that's worth stopping at and everyone that isn't. I tell you all this so you understand something important. I am not the kind of man who scares easily. 11 years on night routes through the bayou will either cure you of irrational fear or break you permanently, and I'm still here. I've driven through Category 2 hurricane remnants on I-10. I've seen accidents that would end a lesser man's career and his sanity along with it. I've had every kind of strange encounter the road can throw at a person, strange people, strange cargoes, strange things moving in the dark at the edge of the headlights that I've learned not to think too hard about. But nothing in 11 years prepared me for what happened 18 months ago. I still think about it every day. I will tell you this story now, not because I'm no longer afraid, because I am. And I will be for the rest of my life, but because I believe people deserve to know that there are things happening in this country, quietly, in the dark, that the official version of reality has absolutely no room for, things that are moving around us on ordinary roads at ordinary hours, watched over by men in unmarked vehicles, heading toward facilities that don't appear on any public map. Make of that what you will. The call came on a Tuesday evening in early October. I was at my kitchen table working through a stack of fuel invoices when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I usually let those go to voicemail and sort through them at the end of the week. Something made me pick it up that night. I've thought about that a lot since. The man on the other end introduced himself as Lawrence. No last name offered, and I didn't ask. His voice was calm and unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has spent a career making unusual requests sound entirely routine. He said he represented a logistics company called Meridian Specialized Transport and that he'd been referred to me by a driver I'd worked alongside years back named Cole, a solid guy who ran the Houston to New Orleans corridor and had a reputation for reliability and discretion. Lawrence had a job. One night, point-to-point transport, highly confidential, with compensation that would match roughly 3 months of my normal income. The number he quoted was $18,000. I don't know many owner-operators who would end that call early. I didn't. He explained the parameters. I'd be picking up cargo at a private marine terminal in Morgan City, Louisiana, and delivering it to a research facility outside of Conroe, Texas. Straightforward route, approximately 3.5 hours of driving. The cargo consisted of sealed, refrigerated units, temperature-sensitive, handled entirely by Meridian's own loading crew. I would not need to touch the containers directly. Then came the conditions, and there were several. The pickup had to take place between 10 and midnight. Non-negotiable. I was not to log the run through my normal dispatcher or mention it to any broker, regulatory contact, or colleague. Meridian would provide all necessary documentation. There was a non-disclosure agreement. He would send it digitally, I would sign digitally, and I was to tell absolutely no one about the cargo, the route, or the client. Not my wife, not my mechanic, no one. I asked him directly whether what I'd be carrying was legal. "Everything you're transporting is fully authorized," he said without a beat of hesitation. "You won't experience any interference from regulatory stops or law enforcement. You have my word on that." He told me a 50% deposit would be transferred immediately upon signing the agreement. The remaining $9,000 upon confirmed delivery. I signed the NDA at 9:47 that evening. By 10:09 I checked my bank account. $9,000 had appeared as if it had always been there. That was the moment something shifted in the back of my mind, a quiet alarm, the kind you can't name and can't ignore. Most clients argue over every dollar. Most clients pay 30 days late and make you follow up twice. Someone who moves $9,000 in 22 minutes is either extremely motivated or extremely connected. I spent most of that night trying to convince myself it was the former. 2 days later, I drove down to Morgan City. For those who don't know it, Morgan City is an old offshore oil service town sitting on the Atchafalaya River, about an hour southwest of Baton Rouge. In the daytime, it has a particular working-class character: drawbridges over bayou channels, processing yards, supply vessels moored 3 and 4 deep at the commercial docks. It's the kind of place that exists to service platforms sitting 60, 80, 100 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico, platforms most people never think about because the work they do keeps the lights on without ever asking for credit. At night, Morgan City feels like the edge of something, like the last place the regular world decided to put up a fence. I arrived at the dock coordinates Lawrence had sent me at 10:40 in the evening. The facility was a private marine supply terminal behind a chain-link gate that a guard checked without expression, running my name against a handwritten list on a clipboard before waving me through without a word. A man met me at the dock. He introduced himself as Victor and offered nothing further. He was built the way men are built when they've spent decades doing physical work in conditions most people wouldn't choose: heavy through the shoulders, hands that looked like they'd been pressed from rubber, a face that had weathered past its probable age and come out the other side, looking like it simply didn't care about the process anymore. He had the flat, assessing look of a man who categorizes people very quickly and finds most of them wanting. "Back the trailer to Dock 4, he said. "Then come with me. My crew handles the load. You don't touch anything in the trailer." He led me to a small office inside the terminal building, bare concrete walls, a single plastic chair under a fluorescent tube that buzzed faintly, a coffee maker on a folding table that had clearly never been introduced to a cleaning cloth. He poured me a cup without asking whether I wanted one and sat across from me on the edge of a metal desk. "You signed the paperwork?" "I did." "Good. Then you understand the terms. Whatever assumptions you're forming about what's in that trailer, set them aside. You're transporting temperature-controlled scientific samples. That is what your documentation states. That is what you repeat without elaboration if anyone asks." "What does the documentation actually cover?" I said. He looked at me for a moment with no readable expression. "I just told you what it covers." I let it go. "One more thing," Victor said, standing. "Under no circumstances do you open those containers, and not for any reason. Not if you believe there's a malfunction. Not if a law enforcement officer instructs you to." He slid a plain index card across the desk. A handwritten phone number. No name, no company, nothing else. "If any situation arises, you call this number first. You wait for instruction before you take any action. Are we clear?" We were clear. I was kept in that office for nearly 2 hours. Through the concrete wall, I could hear the sounds of loading, the low groan of equipment, the occasional shout, the metallic clang of containers being positioned. I drank 2 cups of bad coffee and read the same paragraph of a magazine left on the desk 4 times without retaining a single word of it. Victor came back at 12:50 in the morning and told me the trailer was sealed and ready. When I walked back to my rig, I noticed the smell before I'd gotten within 30 feet of the trailer doors. It was faint, barely there, but it stopped me for a moment because I couldn't immediately place it. It wasn't diesel, it wasn't the dock's usual mix of rust and brine and industrial grease. It was oceanic, but not the way the Gulf Coast smells from the shore. It was something deeper than that, something that suggested cold and pressure and absolute darkness, the smell of water that had never seen the sun. I told myself it was coming from the docks. I climbed into my cab. I got moving. Within 15 minutes of leaving the terminal, I picked up the tail. A dark blue Ford F250 Super Duty, blacked out windows, no identifying markings. It had materialized from a side road approximately a quarter mile behind me and settled into a following position, far enough to seem incidental, close enough to make clear it was anything but. I'm not unfamiliar with being followed. It happens. Cargo theft is real, and some clients invest in protection without advertising it. But this was different from anything I'd encountered before. Whoever was behind that wheel had done this many times. They maintained their distance with a precision that felt mechanical, adjusting to my speed changes with a lag so consistent it seemed rehearsed. It was less like being tailed and more like being escorted. I kept a steady pace westbound on US 90. The bayou country rolled past in darkness on both sides of the highway. Black water glinting briefly through the cypress breaks, the occasional flicker of lights from houses set back off the road. It was a Tuesday night and there was almost no other traffic. Just me, my trailer, and the blue truck holding its position 300 yards back like a shadow that had learned how to drive. I stopped around midnight at a pilot travel center outside of Beaumont for fuel and to use the restroom. The blue F250 pulled into the far end of the parking lot and went dark. I could feel the weight of whoever was inside it watching every move I made, from the moment I stepped down from the cab to the moment I climbed back in. I was 12 minutes at that stop. The blue truck didn't move until I did. Back on the highway, I became aware of another thing that I'd been half registering for the past hour without letting myself address directly. There was a sound coming from the trailer. Very low, almost below the threshold of hearing a slow, rhythmic vibration that I could feel faintly in the seatback as much as I could hear it. I told myself it was the refrigeration compressors cycling on and off under load. It was a reasonable explanation. I held on to it. I was 40 miles from Conroe and beginning to believe the difficult part was behind me when I saw the lights of the mandatory weigh station. I've passed through hundreds of weigh stations over 11 years. They're routine to the point of boredom. You roll on, they check your axle weights, verify your logbook and paperwork, and you're rolling again in under 5 minutes on a good day. I've never had a serious issue at a weigh station in my career. My trailer had barely cleared the scale sensors when the signal board lit up and an officer stepped out of the booth, motioning me into the inspection bay with a flashlight. My stomach turned over. The officer was a state DOT compliance inspector, his name badge reading T. Hollis. He was professional in the way that people who have done a difficult job for a long time are professional. No attitude, no power trip, just the flat efficiency of someone following a procedure they could execute in their sleep. He told me a temperature anomaly alert had triggered on my trailer's sensors when I crossed the scale. Their monitoring system had flagged it. He was required to conduct a visual inspection of the refrigeration units. I pulled out the index card Victor had given me and called the number. It rang and continued ringing. I counted 18 rings before I ended the call and tried again. Same result. I tried a third time. Nothing. Inspector Hollis waited, patient and expressionless. I had no legal basis to refuse him. I got out, walked to the back of the trailer and opened the doors. The containers were arranged in 2 rows the length of the trailer floor, 8 units in total, each one roughly the dimensions of an oversized chest freezer, brushed stainless steel with compression latches, and what appeared to be secondary magnetic seals along the lid perimeter. 7 of them were humming with the low, even sound of properly functioning refrigeration systems. The 8th one wasn't. It was the second unit on the right-hand side, and the difference was immediately visible. A narrow gap had opened along the bottom seam of the lid, perhaps 3 to 4 millimeters across, and a dark liquid had seeped from it, pooling on the trailer floor in a small irregular shape. It wasn't coolant. Coolant is brightly colored and smells synthetic. This was dark, almost black under the inspection bay's lighting, and it had the same quality as the smell I'd noticed at the dock, dense and deep and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Inspector Hollis crouched down to examine the gap. Neither of us spoke, and then the container shifted. It was not violent, it was not loud. It was a single, slow, lateral movement a few inches, no more the kind of thing that under other circumstances might be attributed to road vibration settling or a compressor cycling or simple physics. But Hollis and I both went completely still at the exact same moment, because we both knew in the part of the brain that processes threat before the rational mind has finished deliberating that it was not any of those things. Through the gap in the seal, in the interior of that container, there was light, bioluminescent, pulsing at a slow, measured interval, blue-white in color, the specific shade of something that generates its own illumination in absolute darkness. It pulsed 3 times, each pulse slightly longer than the last, and then it stopped. The silence in that inspection bay was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Inspector Hollis stood up very slowly. He keyed his radio without looking away from the container and said in a voice that he was clearly working to keep level, "I need a supervisor at Bay 2, and I need you to locate the federal protocol binder and call the contact number on the first page. Do it now, please." I don't know exactly what happened in the next 8 minutes. Because I was sitting on the rear bumper of my truck with my hands between my knees, engaged in the basic project of continuing to breathe. I was aware of vehicles pulling into the way station behind me, not commercial vehicles, not police cruisers, black Chevrolet Suburbans, 4 of them, moving fast and pulling up with a certainty that suggested they had not been dispatched from anywhere nearby. They had been waiting somewhere close, already moving. Men in dark clothing came past me without acknowledging I existed. 2 went directly to the trailer. 1 went to Hollis, showed him something in a leather credentials folder, and spoke to him briefly in a voice too low for me to hear. Hollis nodded the way a man nods when he has understood something he didn't want to understand and wants the conversation to be over. One of them came to me. He was approximately 45 years old, lean, with the expression of a man who had excised unnecessary emotional responses from his daily life some years back as a professional efficiency measure. "Mr. Brewer," he said the name from the Meridian documentation, not my real one. "Your paperwork is in order. You'll proceed to your delivery location. We'll be traveling with you from here." "What is in that container?" I said. He looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them. "Temperature-controlled scientific samples, per your documentation." He turned and walked back to one of the Suburbans. 2 of the black vehicles pulled out ahead of me. 2 fell in behind. I drove the remaining distance to Conroe with my hands on the wheel and nothing left in my head except the image of that light, pulsing slowly in the dark like something that had learned how to breathe. The delivery facility sat at the end of a county road with no posted name or address. There was a gate displaying a federal seal I did not recognize, not military, not any agency I could identify from its design, and 2 armed guards who checked credentials from the Suburban ahead of me, but waved my rig through without so much as a glance at my face. A woman in a grey blazer met me at the loading bay. Her ID badge was turned inward against her lapel. She did not introduce herself. "Bay 3, she said. "Leave the engine running. Do not exit the cab until you receive instruction." In my mirrors, I watched a team in full Tyvek protective suits transfer the containers from my trailer onto wheeled carts and move them through an oversized bay door that sealed automatically behind them. The entire operation took 11 minutes. No one looked at me. No one spoke to me. When the last container had cleared the trailer, the woman came back to my window. "You're clear," she said. "Thank you." That was the last thing anyone connected to that job ever said to me in person. I drove home. I don't remember most of that drive. Lawrence called me the following afternoon. "You handled yourself well," he said. "I understand there was a complication at the wait station. I'd call it considerably more than a complication. The situation was resolved. There is no documentation connecting you to the incident. Your paperwork is clean as far as any existing record is concerned. You made a routine regional transport of refrigerated laboratory materials." "What was in those containers, Lawrence?" A pause. "You signed an NDA. "I know what I signed. I'm asking you anyway." A longer pause. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed. It remained calm, measured, almost gentle. "Derek, I want to share something with you, and I want you to receive it as information rather than as any kind of threat, because it isn't one. It's simply context. While you were driving last night, 2 of my colleagues were parked in a vehicle outside your home. Your wife turned off the living room television at 11:22 and went upstairs. Your daughter's bedroom light was on until 10:40, then off. These are facts I'm offering you so that you have an accurate picture of the resources and the reach of what you've become adjacent to through this work." I couldn't produce a response. My throat had stopped working. "Enjoy the money," Lawrence said. "Don't attempt to locate Meridian Specialized Transport. You won't find us. Don't try to identify the facility in Conroe. And I would ask you with some urgency to avoid any research into offshore drilling operations in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically anything referencing Block 247. Go back to your regular routes. Take care of your family. That's the best advice I can give you." The call ended. I moved my family out of Texas 4 months after that night. I did conduct one search before I stopped entirely brief, from a public library terminal, not logged into any account. I found a partially redacted U.S. Coast Guard incident report from the previous spring referencing an emergency response at a Gulf of Mexico drilling sector in the approximate area Lawrence had told me not to look into. 5 crew members listed as unaccounted for. Cause of incident: mechanical failure investigation ongoing. The document's attachment section was fully redacted. The responding vessel information was blacked out. There was a thread on a deep-sea sport fishing forum from a man who described watching military-style salvage vessels working a specific Gulf sector for 3 consecutive weeks the previous summer. Vessels that didn't appear on any of the commercial marine traffic tracking systems he normally used. The thread had 14 replies. 2 days later, when I thought to check again, it was gone. The last thing I found was a cache page from a marine biology researcher's personal website. A single journal entry dated 8 months before the night of my delivery. It read, in its entirety, "The specimen recovered from 3,400 meters in the northeastern Gulf Shelf does not correspond to any known classification. Bioluminescent response patterns to external stimuli suggest neurological activity inconsistent with any identified cephalopod, cnidarian, or deep-sea fish genus. These findings have been reported to the assigned federal liaison per our research agreement. Subsequent communications from that contact have been, I'm not sure how to characterize them. I'll write more when I have more to say. The website no longer exists and I've checked 4 times. I think about those containers sometimes, in the way that you think about something you cannot resolve returning to it, not because you expect a new answer, but because the question itself has become part of how you move through the world. I think about what it means if whatever was inside those sealed steel units came from 3,400 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, from a depth where there is no light, no warmth, and a pressure that the human body would not survive for a single second unprotected. I think about what it means that the federal government was able to position 4 unmarked vehicles and a response team at a Texas way station in under 9 minutes, at 1 in the morning on a random Tuesday in October. I think about what it means that a state DOT inspector had his entire reality reordered by a document shown to him for approximately 30 seconds, after which he functioned like a man who had made a decision about what he was going to remember and what he was going to choose not to. Mostly I think about the light. 3 slow pulses, blue-white, patient. The rhythm of something that had no reason to hurry because it had been waiting in the dark for a very long time and waiting was something it understood. My name isn't Derek. I run local day routes now and I'm home before the sun goes down. I keep a packed bag in the closet. I don't discuss this with anyone, not with my wife, who knows something changed in me that October and has had the grace not to press on it, and not with any of the guys I share the road with. Only with you, right now, with precautions I'm not going to describe, because I believe that whatever I witnessed deserves to exist somewhere outside of a classified document that no member of the public will ever be permitted to read. Out there in the Gulf, 3,400 meters below the surface where no light reaches and nothing that should be alive is supposed to survive, something was found. It was transported on public roads at night by a man who needed the money and asked too few questions before saying yes, and I don't know what happened to it after those bay doors sealed behind it. I don't know if it's still in that facility outside Conroe, or if it's been moved or studied, or if the people studying it are still comfortable with what they've found. What I know is that it was alive. And the people moving it in the dark didn't seem surprised by that at all. They seemed like they had done this before, and they seemed like they intended to do it again, and they seemed like the roads between wherever these things come from and wherever they end up are a great deal busier at night than any of us have been told. Draw whatever conclusions that leads you to. I've already drawn mine, and I sleep with the lights on. We continue. My name is Daniel. I've worked as a security guard for going on 11 years now, and most of that time has been split between construction sites, warehouses, and the occasional shopping center. I'm originally from Guadalajara, but I've been living in Phoenix, Arizona, for the last 7 years, long enough that the heat stopped bothering me, but not long enough that I stopped missing real street tacos. The job I'm about to describe happened during a stretch where I was picking up extra shifts at a cold storage facility on the southwest edge of the city. The place was called Meridian Distribution, a refrigerated logistics hub that stored food products for supermarket chains across the state. We're talking maybe 4 city blocks of warehouse space, all kept between 28 and 34 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the section. They had beef, poultry, produce, pharmaceuticals in the eastern wing. It was a serious operation, dozens of employees on the day shift, a skeleton crew at night, and 2 guards, me and whoever I happened to be paired with that week. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I handled the loading dock side, which meant I was responsible for logging every truck that came in or went out, checking documentation, coordinating with the dock supervisors when drivers needed access, and doing patrol rounds every 90 minutes through the main corridors. It sounds more exciting than it was. Most nights 2 or 3 trucks came in after midnight, loaded up, and were gone by 3 a.m. Then it was just the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional forklift operator finishing a pallet job. I had been at Meridian for about 3 weeks when I got to know the regulars. Truck drivers, like bank customers, fall into patterns. You see the same faces, the same rigs on the same nights. There was a woman named Constance who drove a refrigerated Kenworth and always brought homemade cookies she'd share through the window. There was an older man everyone called Mac, who drove a white Peterbilt and complained about his knees every single time without fail. And then there was the guy I only ever knew as the driver of Rig 7, a tractor trailer from a company called Vantage Cold Chain, with a distinctive blue cab and a white trailer that had a long scratch running diagonally across the left panel, like something had sideswiped it years ago. Rig 7 came in every Wednesday around 1:15 a.m. Always the same window, never more than 10 minutes off. The driver, stocky, maybe late 40s, with a grey beard and a canvas jacket regardless of season, barely spoke. He handed over his paperwork, nodded, drove through. I respected that. Night drivers are tired. Not everyone wants to make small talk at 1 in the morning. What I noticed about Rig 7 and after the first couple of Wednesdays was that it was always out within 45 minutes, in and out. The trailer would be unloaded at Dock 4. The driver would pull forward to the turnaround lot and then he'd exit through the south gate, reliable as a clock. The Wednesday that changed things started exactly the same way. 1:18 a.m. The blue cab rolled up to my booth. I asked for the paperwork, bill of lading, carrier authorization, temperature log. The driver handed over a folder without making eye contact. Everything looked correct. Vantage Cold Chain, load number VCC-4471, 32 pallets of frozen poultry bound for a regional distributor. I logged it in the system, raised the barrier, and he drove through. I radioed Dock 4 to let them know the truck was inbound. The dock supervisor on that shift, a compact, efficient woman named Iris, confirmed she was expecting it and would have a crew ready. 45 minutes passed, then an hour, then 90 minutes. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes loads were complicated. Pallets weren't stacked right. Temperature discrepancies needed to be documented. Paperwork had errors that required phone calls to dispatchers. I'd seen trucks sit at docks for 3 hours over a single mislabeled item, but at the 2-hour mark, I radioed Dock 4. Iris, you still working that Vantage truck? Silence for a moment and then, which Vantage truck? Rig 7, blue cab, Dock 4. Came in around 1:20. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel, I've been here all night. Nothing came into Dock 4. We've been dead since 11. I looked at my logbook. I had written it down myself. The time, the load number, the carrier name, the temperature reading from the cab's digital display, my handwriting, my pen, my notation, VCC-4471, 1:18 a.m. Can you just walk over and check? Maybe the crew took it and forgot to radio. I'm looking at Dock 4 from here, she said. It's empty. The bay door's been closed all night. I told her I'd call her back, and then I went outside to do something I should have done an hour earlier. I walked the facility, all 4 blocks of it. The loading area runs along the north face of the building, 12 dock bays in total, numbered 1 through 12. I walked the full length, checking each bay. Dock 4's door was, as Iris had said, closed. The exterior of that section of wall showed no tire marks in the fresh gravel, no moisture from refrigerated air escaping, nothing. I checked the south lot, the turnaround area where drivers usually waited or repositioned, empty except for a yellow pickup belonging to a maintenance worker. I checked the east access road, the west perimeter, the camera footage on my booth monitor, which covered the main entrance and the dock road. The camera showed the truck entering at 1:18. I could see a clearly blue cab, white trailer, diagonal scratch. The timestamp was right there. It drove down the dock road and turned toward Bay 4, and then nothing. The camera angle didn't cover the full length of the dock road. The truck went around the corner of the building and that was the last image. There was no footage of it leaving, not through the south gate, not through the main entrance, not anywhere. I called the security office inside and asked my partner, a guy named Trevor who covered the interior and pharmaceutical wing, if he'd seen anything unusual. He said no. I asked him to pull up the gate logs on the system. Every vehicle that entered or exited was automatically time-stamped by the barrier sensor. One entry at 1:18 a.m. No corresponding exit. By this point it was nearly 4 a.m., and I was pacing the length of the dock road with my flashlight, trying to work out what I was missing. A fully loaded semi-truck cannot disappear. It weighs 40,000 pounds. It needs a road. It needs a gate. There is no other way out of a fence facility. I called my shift supervisor, a man named Gerald who managed 2 facilities across the city, and only came in when something required actual judgment. I expected him to tell me I'd made an error in the log, or that the truck had taken a route I hadn't thought to check. Instead, when I described what had happened, he went very quiet. "What was the load number?" he asked. "VCC-4471. Another long pause. "Don't go looking for it anymore tonight. Finish your shift. I'll come in at 6. "Gerald, a truck is unaccounted for. I should—" "Finish your shift, Daniel. I'll be there at 6. He hung up. I stood in the cold air outside Dock 4 for a long moment. The refrigeration units hummed behind the wall. Somewhere on the other side of the facility, a forklift beeped as it reversed. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the 40-foot trailer that was not where it was supposed to be, and apparently nowhere else either. Gerald arrived at 6:05 with the facility manager, a serious man named Frank who I had only seen twice before. They looked at my log. They looked at the camera footage. They walked the facility themselves, which told me they didn't entirely disbelieve me, even if neither of them said so. When they came back to the booth, Frank asked me to step inside the small office adjacent to the entrance and close the door. "I want to ask you something," Frank said, "and I want you to think before you answer. Did you, at any point last night, feel drowsy, lose track of time, fall asleep even for a few minutes?" I told him no. I told him I was very sure of that. He nodded slowly. "I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you to keep it between us, not as a cover-up, but because every time this gets repeated, it turns into something that hurts the facility's reputation without adding anything useful." He sat down across from me. "VCC-4471 came to this facility once before, about 14 months ago, before you started here. Different guard on duty, a guy named Raymond who doesn't work for us anymore. He logged the same truck coming in, the same load number, same window of time, same result, no record of it leaving, no truck on the grounds, nothing at Dock 4. "What happened to Raymond?" I asked. Frank looked at Gerald, then back at me. "He quit. He said he wasn't comfortable working here after that, which is his right." I asked the obvious question, whether anyone had ever called Vantage Cold Chain to trace load VCC-4471. Frank's expression shifted slightly. "There is no Vantage Cold Chain, not anymore. The company dissolved 8 years ago. They had a facility in Tucson that closed after an accident on their loading dock. One of their drivers was killed during an overnight unloading. The truck slipped off the jack stands during maintenance and came down on him. He was alone. They didn't find him until the morning shift came in. He let that settle for a moment. We don't know what it is that comes in on Wednesday nights. The paperwork is always real enough to look at, but it doesn't trace back to anything. The load number doesn't exist in any database we've checked. The truck matches descriptions of rigs that Vantage operated before they shut down, but those were all sold for parts or crushed years ago. I thought about the driver, the gray beard, the canvas jacket, the way he never quite met my eyes, the way he handed over the folder without saying a word. Has anyone ever talked to the driver? I asked. Outside of just taking the paperwork? Raymond said he tried. The second time there was a second time with Raymond about a week after the first. He knocked on the cab window and the driver looked at him. Raymond said he looked fine, normal. Except that when he asked the driver his name, the driver just handed him the folder and pointed at the paperwork. Raymond said he had the feeling that the driver couldn't speak. I sat with that for a while. Frank stood up, straightened his jacket. "I want to be honest with you. I can't tell you what's happening here, and I've stopped trying to explain it. What I can tell you is that in 14 months, whatever comes in on that Wednesday never seems to cause any harm. Nothing is missing. The facility is intact. Whatever it is, it comes, and at some point, it leaves, just not through any door we can see." Gerald gave me a look that I interpreted as, "This is the part where you decide whether you keep working here." I kept working there. Another 3 Wednesdays passed. Each one I stayed in my booth, logged no late arrivals, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if exhaustion had combined with a genuine log error in some way I couldn't reconstruct. Then on a Wednesday in early February, at 1:18 a.m., the blue cab rolled up to my booth. I didn't move for a moment. I just looked at it. The scratch on the trailer was the same as I remembered, that long diagonal mark across the left panel, almost like a brush stroke. The engine idled with a low, even rumble. The window was already down. The driver was looking straight ahead, not at me. I stepped out of the booth and walked to the window. The driver's hands were resting on the wheel. He was exactly as I remembered: a grey beard, canvas jacket, the particular stillness of a man who has been driving for so many hours that being motionless feels like the more natural state. I said, "I need to ask you something before I log you in." He didn't turn his head. "Where are you taking this load?" "Nothing. The company on this paperwork doesn't exist anymore." His hands tightened slightly on the wheel, just the knuckles. And then this is the part I've thought about more than anything else. He turned and looked directly at me for the first time in all the Wednesdays I'd seen him. And what I noticed wasn't anything supernatural. It wasn't what you might expect from a ghost story. What I noticed was that he looked exhausted, not frightened, not threatening. Just a man who had been driving for a very long time and hadn't found where he was supposed to stop. He held out the folder. I took it. I looked at it. VCC-4471. Everything in order, exactly as always. I raised the barrier. I watched him drive down the dock road and turn left toward Bay 4. I called Iris and told her to check whether anything arrived at Dock 4 that night. She told me, as she always did, that the bay was empty and had been all evening. He was gone by 3 a.m., or at least by 3 a.m. The truck was no longer anywhere on the grounds. It left no tire marks, no temperature variance in Bay 4, no record in the exit sensor. I've been at Meridian for 2 years now. Rig 7 comes every 4 or 5 weeks, not always on a Wednesday anymore, and not always at the same time. Sometimes I log it, sometimes when I'm doing a perimeter walk and I come back to find the entry in my own handwriting. I'm not sure exactly when I wrote it. Gerald told me once, when I pressed him, that the facility was built on land that used to be a trucking depot, one of the old regional carriers that went under in the 90s. He said he wasn't implying anything, just sharing the history. I think about that driver sometimes, the way he looked at me that night, not like something from another world, but like someone stuck in this one, still running a route that no longer exists, to a company that isn't there, delivering a load that never arrives. I don't know if that's sadder than whatever I was expecting it to be. I still raise the barrier when he comes. It seems like the least I can do. We continue. The night my wife found the photographs was the same night I finally understood that some debts are not paid with money. I have been a long-haul trucker for almost 18 years, not the romantic kind you see in movies, with gleaming chrome rigs and open highways stretching toward painted sunsets. The real kind. The kind that eats cold gas station sandwiches at 2 in the morning, that watches the white dashes on the highway hypnotize you into near sleep somewhere outside of Amarillo, that misses birthdays, school plays, anniversary dinners, and first steps, all in the name of getting someone else's merchandise from one corner of the country to the other on schedule. I started at 23, the way most men in my family started anything, out of necessity. My father had worked at a textile factory his whole life, and retired with bad knees and a pension that barely covered his medication. My older brother tried college, racked up debt, and ended up doing landscaping anyway. I looked at both roads and decided that at least trucking paid decently from the beginning, required no loans, and would give me the kind of independence that sitting at a desk would never allow. For 12 years, I worked for Meridian Freight Solutions, a mid-sized logistics company based out of Chattanooga. It was honest work, the kind of place where management knew your kids' names, and the dispatcher, a heavy-set woman named Clara, always kept a pot of coffee on for whoever came in early. We were roughly 40 drivers, and we looked out for each other the way people do when they share the particular loneliness of long nights on empty roads. Then the company was acquired. The new ownership sent in a regional director named Breckenridge. We never called him by his first name because he never offered it. He was 31 years old with a business degree, soft hands, and the particular confidence of someone who has never had to eat a meal standing up beside a loading dock. He arrived on a Monday in a dark blue sedan, and by Friday of that same week, Clara had been let go and 3 of our senior drivers had received termination notices by email. Not even a conversation. An email. What followed over the next several months was a systematic dismantling of everything that had made that job bearable. The overtime policies changed. The per diem rates dropped. Routes were extended without additional compensation. And if you complained, Breckenridge had a way of looking at you over his reading glasses that made you feel you were not a person but a cost center that had gotten above its station. I tried to keep my head down. I had Denise at home and our son Marcus, who was 9 by then and had started asking why I was always tired and never wanted to throw the football in the backyard. I needed the job. I told myself I could outlast Breckenridge. Men like that burn bright and burned out. But there are things a man can absorb and things he cannot. The first thing I could not absorb happened on a Tuesday in February. I had submitted a request 3 weeks in advance to take a personal day on the 14th. It was the anniversary of my wedding, the 15th year. Denise and I had been through a lot. 2 miscarriages before Marcus, her mother's illness, 3 moves in 4 years. That 15th anniversary mattered to her in a way she had explained to me quietly and carefully, which meant it mattered to me as well. Breckenridge denied the request the morning of the 13th, not with an explanation, with a single-line response in the company portal. Request not approved. Route coverage required. I drove 640 miles that anniversary. I called Denise from a truck stop in Alabama while the restaurant reservation expired. She said it was fine. She always said it was fine. I sat in that cab for 20 minutes after the call ended, staring at the fuel gauge, and I was not fine at all. The second thing happened 4 months later, in June, and it was the thing I could not forgive. My father had a stroke on a Thursday afternoon. He was 71, and the stroke was severe enough that when the hospital called Denise, because I was somewhere outside of Memphis with my phone on silent, the doctor used phrases like, "We need to prepare and limited time remaining." Denise reached me through the dispatch line. I turned the truck around immediately, called Breckenridge's number, and told him what had happened. He told me to complete the delivery first. "It's a 4-hour detour," he said. "Your father has been stabilized. There is nothing you can do in the next 4 hours that the hospital staff cannot do better." "He's asking for me," I said. I remember my voice was very quiet. That is what happens to me when I am at the edge. I go very quiet. "Complete the delivery, then you can take the personal time," Breckenridge said. "I'll authorize 2 days of bereavement when the time comes." When the time comes, he said those words, and when the time comes. I completed the delivery. I do not know why exactly. I think I was in shock. I think some part of me believed that if I kept moving, kept doing the thing that was expected, the rest of it might hold together somehow. My father died at 6:47 in the evening. I was on the interstate 45 miles from the hospital when Denise called again. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the highway. I sat there for a long time. 18-wheelers blew past me and the whole cab shook with each one. I did not cry. I just sat there, looking at the yellow emergency lights blinking on my dashboard. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision that I did not fully understand yet. I told 2 of my closest colleagues what had happened, a driver named Samuel who had been with Meridian longer than anyone, and a younger guy named Cole who had come up through the same training program I had and who I trusted more than most people I knew. We were eating lunch together in the break room the following week when I told them about the call, about the 4-hour detour, about when the time comes. Samuel set down his sandwich and did not pick it up again. Cole said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Something needs to happen to that man." And Samuel, who was the most even-tempered person I had ever worked with, who collected stamps and coached Little League and went to church every Sunday, Samuel said, "I know someone." What he knew was this: his grandmother, who had passed 2 winters before, had been what people in her community called a root worker. It was not a term she used for herself, Samuel said. She did not advertise what she did. But people came to her home on Saturday mornings and left with small cloth bundles and specific instructions, and sometimes things changed for them afterward in ways they found difficult to explain to anyone outside that circle of quiet belief. After she died, Samuel had packed up her belongings. In a cedar chest beneath her bed, wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with kitchen twine, he had found 2 composition notebooks filled with her handwriting, dense, careful cursive, interspersed with small diagrams and what appeared to be recipes, though the ingredients were not anything you would find in a grocery store. He had not thrown them away. He could not explain why. They had sat in a box in his garage for 2 years. "There's something in there," he told us that afternoon in the break room. his voice measured and careful. About settling accounts, that's how she phrased it, not revenge, settling accounts. She had strong feelings about the difference. Cole asked what that meant in practice. Samuel said he was not entirely sure, but that he had read the passage several times, and it seemed to involve taking something that belonged to a person, something they used daily and touched often, and performing a specific sequence of actions with it. The intended result was not harm, he emphasized. It was disturbance, an unease that would follow the subject, sleeplessness, a persistent sense of being watched, discomfort in the place they felt most secure. We'd be making him uncomfortable, Cole said slowly, not hurting him. That's the intention, Samuel said. We looked at each other around that table. I want to be honest about what I was thinking in that moment. I was thinking about my father's voice on the phone 2 weeks before the stroke, asking me when I was coming to visit, and I was thinking about Denise's face when she told me he was gone, and I was thinking about the yellow emergency lights blinking on my dashboard on the side of the interstate. I was not thinking clearly. I was thinking from somewhere much older and much angrier than reason. I said yes. We met at Samuel's house on a Wednesday evening. He had the notebooks on the kitchen table. They were exactly as he had described, small black and white marbled covers, filled with his grandmother's handwriting in blue ballpoint pen. The diagrams were precise and the instructions were specific. There was no theatrical darkness to it, no symbols drawn in candlelight. It looked like a recipe card from someone who happened to be working with unusual ingredients. Samuel had obtained something of Breckenridge's, a company pen that he had borrowed from the man's desk and never returned. A small thing, but Samuel said his grandmother's notes indicated that something personally handled was sufficient. Cole seemed nervous. He kept looking at the window. I remember the kitchen felt unusually cold, though it was a warm evening in June and the back door was closed. Samuel read from the notebook quietly. It took about 4 minutes. At the end, Cole said he thought he heard something on the porch, but when he went to check, there was nothing there. What remained in the kitchen was a smell not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like iron and old wood and something damp. It dissipated slowly over the next hour, even with the windows open. We went home. We did not speak much. The following morning, Breckenridge was not in the office. He was not in the office the morning after that either. By the third day, the acting manager, a quiet logistics coordinator named Parrish, who had clearly been briefed to say as little as possible, was handling our route assignments. When I asked directly what had happened to Breckenridge, Parrish looked somewhere past my shoulder and said there had been a personal matter. On the 5th day, Samuel found me by the fueling station and spoke quietly without looking at me. He said he had heard from one of the administrative assistants that Breckenridge had been hospitalized. I asked what for. Samuel said, "They're saying it's a psychiatric evaluation, that he stopped sleeping, that he called his wife 4 nights in a row, convinced that someone was in the apartment and there was never anyone there." I stood very still at that fueling station. "That's what it was supposed to do," Cole said later when I told him. "That's exactly what it was supposed to do. He'll rest, he'll be evaluated, they'll adjust whatever needs adjusting, he'll be fine." But Breckenridge was not fine, and he died on the 9th day of his absence. The company sent a brief email acknowledging his passing and offering a grief counseling line. The cause listed in the local obituary was cardiac arrest. He was 31 years old. None of us said anything to each other for 2 weeks. Then things began happening at the facility. The dispatch office, Breckenridge's former workspace, developed a problem with its electrical system that no contractor could fully diagnose. Lights flickered on no pattern. The building's HVAC cycled on and off regardless of the thermostat settings. 3 of the administrative staff filed separate reports about hearing someone walking in the hallway outside the office late in the evening when the building was supposed to be empty. Samuel started finding the composition notebooks had moved in the night. He had locked them in a strongbox in his garage. They had not been touched. But he would open the box and the notebooks would be facing a different direction or open to a different page than the one he had left them on. He did not tell Cole and me about this for several days. When he did, his hands were not entirely steady. Cole began losing sleep. He developed what he described as a feeling of being observed not inside buildings but on the road, in the truck. At 3 in the morning on a long empty stretch of highway, he would check the mirror and be almost certain there was a presence in the sleeper cab behind him. He always turned around and there was nothing. He told me he had started sleeping with the overhead light on, both in the cab and at home. The smell came back to the break room, the same smell from Samuel's kitchen. 3 separate employees mentioned it without prompting, and none of them had any way to know what it meant. I began having a recurring dream. In it I was driving, which was not unusual, but the road did not go anywhere. It simply continued, white dashes appearing and disappearing under the headlights, and in the passenger seat in my peripheral vision was a shape that I could never fully look at directly. Every time I turned my head toward it, I woke up. Samuel found the woman through a cousin who offered no further explanation. She was in her mid-60s, worked from a small house on the east side of the city, and when she opened the door for us, she studied all 3 of our faces for a long moment before she stepped aside to let us in. We had not told her anything beyond our first names. She sat across from us in a small sitting room and said, "What did you use?" Samuel produced the notebooks. She took them, studied several pages, then set them down carefully. "These belonged to someone who knew what she was doing," she said, "and that is the problem. When you use tools that were built by someone with genuine knowledge and you use them without that knowledge yourself, the outcome is not precise, it is not surgical. It is like picking up a scalpel when you have never studied anatomy." She looked at each of us in turn. "The man died," she said. "It was not a question." "We didn't intend," Cole started. "I know you didn't," she said, "but intention is not the whole of the matter. There are forces that, once invited, interpret their instructions broadly. You asked for disturbance and sleeplessness. They provided it. And when a man already carries whatever that man carried, his health, his history, the particular architecture of his stress, the disturbance found its leverage." She was quiet for a moment. "He is not at rest," she said finally. "And the thing that attached itself to him in his final days has not released him. They are tethered to each other and to the place where you first performed the work, which is why you are experiencing what you are experiencing." None of us spoke. "I can sever the attachment to the place and to yourselves," she said. "I cannot undo what happened to him. That is beyond my authority and frankly beyond anyone's in this room." She paused. "The notebooks will remain with me. They should have been buried with their owner. Since they weren't, I will take responsibility for them now." She worked for nearly an hour. She moved through Samuel's house because she insisted on going there first, to the place where it had started, with salt and particular oils and words spoken in a register so low I could not make out the language. Samuel cried twice and seemed not to know he was doing it. When she was finished, she sat down and looked older than when we had arrived. "I want you to understand something," she said. "What that man did to you was real. The cruelty was real. The grief of missing your father's passing, that is a wound that was inflicted on you, and you had every right to your anger." She looked at me when she said this, directly and without comfort. "But you reached for something that was too large for what the situation required. A man is dead. Whether he deserved your anger does not change the fact that a man is dead." She stood and walked us to the door. "What happens to him now?" I asked. "His spirit or whatever." "That," she said, "is not in my hands or yours." She looked at me steadily. "The only thing in your hands now is what you do with the time you have. That has always been the only thing." Breckenridge's replacement was a woman named Torres who had worked in logistics for 20 years and brought Clara back within her first week. The break room smelled like nothing by August. The lights in the dispatch office stopped their flickering sometime in late summer, and no one mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallway again. Cole transferred to a different route the following year, closer to home. He told me he sleeps fine now. I believe him mostly. Samuel retired early. He gave me no explanation beyond saying that he was ready for a different kind of quiet. I have not asked for more than that. I still drive. I still take the long routes, the overnight runs, the 600-mile hauls that empty out your thoughts, until there is nothing left but the road and the white dashes appearing and disappearing under the lights. Sometimes very late and very tired, I check the passenger mirror without meaning to. There is never anything there. I have told myself for 3 years now that this means the woman's work held, that the account has been balanced or at least closed, that whatever remained of Breckenridge has found whatever follows the kind of ending he had. I do not know if I believe this. What I know is that my father is buried in a cemetery in eastern Tennessee, and I was not with him when he died, and that is a thing I carry in the particular way you carry things that cannot be set down. I also know that a 31-year-old man is buried somewhere with a wife who probably still does not fully understand what happened to him in those final nights. I did not know he had a wife until I read the obituary. He had never seemed like someone who could be loved by anyone. People like that usually are someone's person, though. That is the thing you forget when your anger is large enough. I am not asking for your sympathy or your judgment or your absolution. I am just telling you what happened. Because some things are too heavy to carry alone and the road is very long, and there are stretches in the early hours of the morning when the silence in a truck cab becomes something almost unbearable, and you need somewhere to put the weight, even if it is only here, even if it is only for tonight. We continue. My name is Aaron. I'm 33 years old and I live in Columbus, Ohio, where I work as a network infrastructure analyst for a mid-sized logistics company downtown. I know that's a mouthful of a job title. The short version is that I make sure computer systems talk to each other correctly, and when they don't, I'm the one who gets a phone call at 2 in the morning. I've been doing this kind of work for nearly a decade, and if there's one thing that profession teaches you, it's that everything has a root cause. An error doesn't just happen. A system doesn't fail for no reason. You trace the problem back to its source, you find the explanation, and you fix it. That's how I was trained to think. That's how I still think most of the time. I'm telling you this because I want to be completely clear about the kind of person I am before I tell you what happened to my friend Travis. I've never been someone who entertains ghost stories or takes paranormal claims seriously. Not out of arrogance, I'm not trying to make anyone feel foolish, but because my honest, considered belief has always been that the world operates according to rules that can be understood, and that most things people label as inexplicable are simply unexplained, which is a very different thing. When a coworker shares a video about a haunted location, I'm polite about it. But privately, I'm running through the checklist. Poor lighting, sleep deprivation, suggestion, misidentified animal, infrasound, carbon monoxide. There are 100 explanations that don't require us to rethink the nature of reality. I used to find that checklist very reassuring. This past spring, my girlfriend Claudia and I closed on our first house, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Clintonville, one of the older neighborhoods on the north side of the city. The house was built in the 1940s, needed some cosmetic work, and had a furnace that we were warned about by 3 separate inspectors. But it had original hardwood floors throughout and a backyard with 2 oak trees, and Claudia signed the paperwork the same afternoon we toured it. We'd been renting since we were 22. Owning something that was actually ours felt like a milestone worth marking properly. We planned a dinner party for 6 weeks after the closing. Once the boxes were unpacked and the walls were painted and we'd finally figured out where the furniture was going to go, we invited 11 people. I cooked for 2 days in advance, more than was probably necessary, and Claudia found a table runner that matched the dining room walls, which she was very pleased about. It was supposed to be a relaxed, celebratory evening, nothing complicated. Travis was one of the 11. I've known Travis since we were 17 years old, which at this point is more than half my life. We played on the same recreational soccer team after college, and he was the first person I called when Claudia said yes when I asked her to move in with me. And he was in the front row at my father's funeral 3 years ago. He grew up working in his uncle's auto repair shop, went through a stretch of construction labor in his late 20s, and had been doing security work for about 4 years by the time of the dinner. He was the kind of man who was easy to rely on precisely because nothing seemed to throw him. He was physically large, unhurried in everything he did, and had a specific dry sense of humor that made people trust him almost immediately. I mention all of this not because it's incidental, but because it's essential. The man I'm about to describe arriving at my front door was not that person. Or rather, he was that person drained of everything that made him that person. The dinner was on a Saturday in late April. By 7 o'clock, everyone had arrived except Travis. He texted that afternoon. I still have the message saying he'd be there by 7:30 and that he was bringing a bottle of something he claimed I owed him from a poker night the previous fall. I remember reading it and laughing. That was exactly his tone, exactly his timing. 7:30 came and went, then 8, then 8:30. I sent 2 messages that went unread. One of our guests, a woman who worked with Claudia and had met Travis a few times, suggested he'd probably been held over at work, since we all knew he'd recently started a night security position at a storage facility on the east side. I agreed, though it bothered me slightly that he wasn't responding. Travis always responded. Even when he was busy, even when the message wasn't urgent, he always sent at least a 1-word confirmation that he'd seen it. By 9, dinner was long finished, the plates were cleared, and we'd moved into the living room. I was refilling glasses and half listening to a conversation about property taxes when I heard 3 slow knocks at the front door. I crossed the foyer and opened it. Travis was standing on the porch, and I want to describe this as accurately as I can, because I've thought about it many times since. There was a fraction of a second, genuinely just a fraction, where I had to consciously register that the man in front of me was my friend, because the surface presentation was so different from what I expected that my brain hesitated before matching it. His face, which normally carried a settled, easy confidence, looked like something had been removed from it. Not from the outside, but from underneath. His eyes were red at the rims. His jaw was set hard. The way you hold your jaw when you're trying to keep something from showing. He was still wearing his grey work jacket with the facility's name on the sleeve, which meant he had come here directly from wherever he had been without stopping at home first. His hands, when I noticed them, were trembling very slightly at his sides. "Travis," I said, "what happened to you?" He looked past me into the house, then back at my face, and exhaled very slowly through his nose. "I need to come inside," he said. "I'm sorry about dinner. I'm sorry I didn't answer." I stepped back and let him in. The room quieted when he appeared. People noticed. No one said anything, pointed, no one made a joke about the hour because it was immediately, visually apparent that something was genuinely wrong with him, and everyone in the room was perceptive enough to see it. Claudia got up without being asked and took his jacket. Someone slid a chair closer to the center of the room. I poured him 2 fingers of whiskey and set a glass of water beside it, and he reached for the whiskey first and held it in both hands for a moment before drinking. He sat on the edge of the couch with his forearms resting on his knees, staring at the floor. I could see a faint tremor in his right knee, a nervous habit I recognized from the early days of our friendship, something he did when he was genuinely anxious, not just annoyed or uncomfortable, but actually unsettled in a way that had gotten past his defenses. "You don't have to talk about anything tonight," I said. "We can just—" "No." He said it quietly, but with a certainty that stopped me. "I have to say it. If I sit on this by myself, I'm going to lose my mind." He took another drink, set the glass down on the coffee table with both hands, and looked at us. "I need you to let me start from the beginning," he said, "because without the context, none of the rest of it will make sense." Travis had been working the overnight shift at Lakeview Self-Storage for about 3 months at that point. The facility was a large indoor complex, 3 floors, over 400 climate-controlled units ranging from small lockers to rooms big enough to hold the contents of a house. It was the kind of place where people stored furniture between moves or kept boxes of old paperwork or held on to things they couldn't throw away but had no room for. Travis's shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. When he'd started, there were usually 2 people on overnights, but there had been staffing problems of some kind, and for the last 2 months he'd largely been running the shift alone. He'd found it manageable, mostly boring, he said, which was fine. He was trying to save money for a truck, and the overnight differential made the rate worth it. He made rounds every 2 hours, monitored the camera feeds, logged any access after midnight, buzzed in renters with legitimate fobs. Some nights nothing happened at all except the hum of the climate control system and the occasional ping of his phone. He'd been reading paperback novels and listening to podcasts and had basically accepted that this would be the texture of his nights for the foreseeable future. The first time he saw the woman was in early February. He was at the front desk around 3 in the morning going through a maintenance checklist when the entrance buzzer sounded. The exterior camera showed a woman standing at the glass front door. He put her at somewhere between 75 and 85 years old. It was hard to be precise from the camera angle. She had white hair pulled back loosely at the neck, was wearing a pale grey cardigan over what looked like a house dress, and carried a small canvas bag over one arm. She stood with the patient, slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who had been waiting at doors their whole life and had learned not to be annoyed by it. Travis thought someone's grandmother at 3 in the morning, which was odd but not inherently alarming. After-hours access was fully permitted for renters with active fobs. He buzzed her in. She came through the lobby without looking at the desk, walked directly down the corridor toward the back of the first floor, the section designated Block D, and disappeared around the corner. About 35 minutes later, the front door chimed as she exited. Travis watched her cross the parking lot on the exterior camera until she was out of frame, then went back to his checklist. He thought nothing more of it that night. But she came back the following night, and the night after that. By the end of the second week, he'd started keeping informal notes because the pattern was precise enough to be remarkable. She arrived between 3:09 and 3:14 a.m. every single night, no exceptions for weekdays or weekends. The same house dress, variations of it in muted colors, gray, pale blue, once a faded green. Always the same small canvas bag. Always the same unhurried, deliberate walk directly to Block D. She never glanced at the desk, never acknowledged Travis's presence in any way, never stopped to use the restroom or the vending machine near the stairwell. She stayed between 20 and 30 minutes and then she left. Travis ran the access log and confirmed her fob was registered to Unit 470, one of the medium-sized units near the back wall of the first floor. He mentioned her to Marcus, a co-worker who overlapped with him on the early evening hours, and Marcus shrugged and said he didn't pay much attention to regulars, that the unit had been rented for years, and that some people just kept odd hours. This was a reasonable explanation, and Travis mostly accepted it. Mostly. What he couldn't quite let go of was not the regularity itself, but a particular quality of her movements that he found difficult to name, but increasingly difficult to ignore. People who came to storage facilities at strange hours were usually there for a clear, practical reason. They'd just finished a long drive, or they worked nights and this was their only free window, or they were between apartments and needed something urgently. There was always an air of purpose with a slight edge of inconvenience, a sense of someone who would rather be doing this at a different time but couldn't. This woman didn't have that quality. She moved the way someone moves through a space they've been moving through for so long that it no longer requires attention, like walking to your own kitchen in the dark, and she never seemed to hear him. He had tried on several occasions to greet her as she passed. He said good morning. He noted that it was cold out. He asked once if she needed help finding anything. Nothing. She didn't turn, didn't slow down, didn't flinch. He began to genuinely wonder if she wore hearing aids and had them turned off, or if she was simply the kind of person who sealed herself off completely from surroundings she decided weren't relevant to her. In early March, he made the decision to follow her. He waited until she had passed the desk and was 10 feet into the Block D corridor, then stepped out from behind his station and walked quietly after her. The hallway was long and straight, fluorescent lights overhead, sealed concrete floors, metal roll-up doors on both sides in two facing rows. Sound moved through that space clearly. He could hear the faint drag of her slippers against the floor, a soft, unhurried rhythm. He stayed back about 25 feet, watching. She reached the end of the row and stopped in front of Unit 47D. Travis held his position near the midpoint of the hallway. He watched her reach into the canvas bag and remove a key. A physical key, old-fashioned, cut from metal, the kind that belongs on a ring with other keys. This was immediately strange to him because the facility had converted all units to electronic fob locks 3 years ago as part of a renovation. There were no physical key locks in Block D anymore. He watched her insert it. He watched her turn it. He watched the roll-up door rise. She stepped inside and he moved toward the unit slowly, trying to see past her into the interior before she became aware of his approach. He was about 8 or 9 feet away when she turned around. He told us this part the most carefully. He said he'd been expecting one of two things. Either she would be startled or she would be annoyed. What he got was neither. She turned with a slowness that felt chosen, not accidental, as if she had known he was there the entire time and had only now decided to acknowledge it. She turned and she looked directly at him, and her face was not right. He worked hard to explain what he meant by that because he said it wasn't a matter of any specific feature being obviously wrong. It was more like the aggregate of the features. The eyes were spaced slightly too wide for the structure of the head. The mouth was a fraction too broad. The skin of her cheeks was flat in a way that didn't match the underlying architecture, not slack, not swollen, just flat. He said the overall impression was of a face that was nearly correct, which made the parts that weren't correct significantly worse because your mind kept trying to resolve the error and couldn't. She looked at him. She did not blink. He said his body moved before his mind had fully processed what it was doing, one step backward, involuntary, not a decision so much as a reflex. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he managed. "I just wanted to check that everything was all right back here." She opened her mouth. No words came out. What he heard instead, and he repeated this twice to make sure we understood him, was a sound like air being released slowly through something soft and wet. Not a cough, not a breath. Just that sound, low and continuous, lasting about 3 seconds. Then every fluorescent light in Block D went out simultaneously. The emergency floor-level strips activated almost immediately, casting the hallway in a dim, reddish glow. Travis stood in that red light and looked toward Unit 47D. The roll-up door was down, closed and locked, the padlock hanging in place as if it had never been touched. She was gone. He stood completely still and he told us that he spent approximately 10 seconds in that stillness just verifying what he was seeing. No door open, no woman, nothing that explained her disappearance. Then from inside the closed unit he heard a sound, slow and dry, rhythmic, like paper being turned, or fingernails drawn in long, slow passes across the inside of the door. He took one step toward it. The sound moved. It was now behind him, coming from the far end of the empty hallway. He turned around. Nothing. The corridor ran red and empty in both directions. Travis walked back to the lobby. He was very precise about the word he used. He walked. He said he made a deliberate choice not to run because running would have meant confirming something he was not prepared to confirm. But he also said that by the time he reached his desk, his hands were shaking so badly that he swept his coffee cup off the edge without noticing, and only registered it when he heard it hit the floor. His supervisor reviewed the Block D footage the following morning. The cameras showed Travis rising from his station and walking into the corridor at 3:21 a.m. They showed him stopping partway down the row. They showed him step backward. They showed the lights go dark and the emergency strips engage. They showed Travis walking quickly back to the lobby. They did not show any woman entering Block D. The manager pulled the front lobby footage and found the timestamp for the entrance buzzer, 3:11 a.m. The exterior door had opened, the mechanism had activated, but the frame-by-frame footage showed the door swinging open with nothing visible on the other side. No body, no shadow, no disruption of the air. Then the manager looked at the paper sign-in sheet, a backup log kept at the front desk alongside the digital system. At 3:11 a.m. in faded blue ink, in a patient, unhurried cursive hand, was a signature. Dorothy Albright, Unit 47D. The manager told Travis that Dorothy Albright had been a long-term renter at Lakeview for many years. She had been, by all accounts, a reliable and quiet customer. Approximately 3 years prior, her family had called the facility to inform them that she had passed away a stroke at her home in her early 80s. The family had said they'd be in touch about clearing the unit. They never followed up. Because her bank account continued to process the monthly automatic payment, the unit remained active and on the books. After the manager left, Travis pulled the old paper sign-in logs from the filing cabinet behind the front desk. He went through them page by page, working backward. Dorothy Albright's signature appeared on the overnight log every single night for the previous 3 years. The same faded blue ink, the same careful cursive. Every night without exception, including Sundays, including holidays, including the night he checked the date 3 times that her family had called the facility to report that she was dead. Travis resigned the following week. He didn't explain why in the letter. The manager, he said, did not ask. We sat in my living room in Clintonville for a long time after he finished. I can't speak for everyone else, but I can tell you that I wasn't looking for the flaws in his story. I wasn't running my checklist. Travis had been my friend for 16 years. He did not lie. He did not invent things for an audience. Whatever had happened to him on that concrete floor, in that red emergency light with that sound coming from behind a locked door, he had experienced it, and it had not finished with him yet. That was plain to see. After he left that night, I did what I suspect most people with my particular set of habits would do. I tried to find the explanation. I searched the public records. I found a death notice for Dorothy Albright of Columbus, Ohio, age 83, published 3 years ago in March, survived by 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. Services held at a funeral home on the south side of the city. There was a photograph. It showed a woman with white hair pulled back at the neck, wearing a gray cardigan, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression was settled and still, the expression of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. I sat with that photograph for a very long time. And then, because I'm a details person and I apparently could not help myself, I looked up one more thing. I searched the address of Lakeview Self-Storage. Then I searched the address of the cemetery listed in the obituary Green Lawn on the southern edge of the city where Dorothy Albright had been interred. 7/10 of a mile. That's the distance between them, door to gate. Unit 47D sits along the building's east wall. The east wall is the wall that faces the direction of the cemetery. I have spent 5 months telling myself that there's a rational explanation for all of it. I've gone through the checklist more times than I can count. Faulty lighting system in Block D, mass suggestion among the overnight staff, clerical errors in the sign-in logs, a glitch in the camera system that made a small woman difficult to see on footage, a family member visiting the unit under the deceased's name for reasons that were never explained to the facility. I've thought of all of these things. Not one of them explains the sound that Travis heard inside a padlocked empty unit on a sealed concrete floor at 3 in the morning, moving from one side of a wall to the other without a body to carry it. I've stopped trying to find the explanation. Some things, I've had to conclude, are not unexplained. They are something else entirely. We continue. For professional and legal reasons, I won't be sharing my real name or identifying the exact location on the line where this happened. What I will say is that I've spent almost 17 years working as a signal and communications technician for a regional railroad company in the Pacific Northwest. And in all that time, through equipment failures in the dead of winter, derailments, communication blackouts during the worst of storm season, I never once considered asking for a transfer. I was the person supervisors called when something wasn't right and they needed someone methodical and steady on site. I handled problems. That was my job. I'm telling you this so you understand the kind of person I am before I tell you what happened to me on the night of January 11th, 2019, at a remote signal station 14 miles up an unpaved access road in the mountains, because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe doesn't come from someone given to panic or exaggeration. I'm a technician. I troubleshoot by the book. I don't jump to conclusions. And yet, after almost 2 years of sitting on this story, I still cannot explain it. Not fully. Not in any way that satisfies me. The assignment started as routine. A signal fault had been flagged in our monitoring system around 4 p.m. One of the track occupancy sensors at a remote relay station was sending intermittent bad data. Under normal conditions, a 40-minute drive and a 90-minute repair. But by the time the work order hit my screen, the weather service had already issued a winter storm advisory, and my supervisor, I'll call him Dale, contacted me directly on the radio. "I'm not ordering you up there," he said, "but if that sensor drops out completely and a freight comes through the section without occupancy data, we've got a serious problem. You're the closest technician to the access road. Can you make it before dark?" I checked the clock. 4:40. Dark around 5:15. "I'll go," I said. The access road to Signal Station 7 was a fire service road, unpaved, narrow, steep in stretches, and already carrying 2 to 3 inches of fresh snow when I turned onto it. By mile 6, the snow had intensified to near whiteout. I was relying on fog lights and the proprietary GPS overlay on my dash, moving at maybe 15 miles an hour. The trees on either side of the road were loaded with snow, and the wind was shaking them, dropping cascades that hit the windshield without warning. I wasn't frightened. I'd driven this road in worse, but I was focused. You stay focused in those conditions or you end up in a ditch. I arrived at the station at approximately 5:50 p.m. Signal Station 7 is a basic field installation, a concrete equipment housing about the size of a generous garden shed, a utility pole with communication hardware overhead, and a steel door protected by a weather shutter over an electronic keypad. These stations are unmanned. Under normal operating procedures, the only personnel with the current access code are certified signal technicians. The code is updated every quarter and only distributed to active, credentialed staff in the department. I stepped out of the truck and saw 2 things almost at the same moment. First, there were boot tracks in the snow leading to the station entrance, already partially obscured by fresh accumulation, indicating they'd been made at least 30 to 40 minutes before my arrival. Second, the door was not fully closed. It was pulled to within an inch of the frame, but the latch hadn't caught. I stopped moving. I stood in the driving snow and just looked at that for a moment. There had been no other technicians authorized to Station 7 that day. Dale had told me explicitly I was the only person he was sending out. I radioed Dale, told him the door had been compromised, that I had fresh tracks in the snow, that I was going to take a look before assuming anything. He told me to be careful and call back when I was inside. Then I pushed the door open. The interior of a relay station is not spacious. 10 by 12 feet packed with terminal blocks, relay racks, and a narrow work surface along one wall. Mounted to the wall on a folding hinge is a small chair, the kind you flip down when you need to crouch and access lower panels. There's no heating unit, but the equipment generates enough residual warmth to keep the temperature slightly above freezing. Sitting in that folding chair was a man. He looked to be around 60, lean, with a weathered face and grey stubble along his jaw. He was wearing railroad work clothes, a heavy canvas jacket, wool trousers, leather boots with thick soles, the kind of gear that was standard issue decades ago before the company converted to synthetic materials. He had a company badge clipped to his chest pocket. His hands were resting folded in his lap, and he was holding a flashlight, an old incandescent model that takes D batteries. It was switched off. He looked up when I entered. He showed no surprise whatsoever. He simply nodded, the way a colleague would nod at you in a corridor. Figured someone would come out about the sensor, he said. Intermittent ground fault on terminal block 4, left side. The binding screws worked loose from vibration. I kept my flashlight on him. Who are you? Marcus, he said. Marcus Hale, signal and communications, same as you. How did you get in here? The keypad. 153244, he said. The back of my neck tightened. Those were the current access digits, issued 2 weeks prior, distributed to a list of 12 active technicians, myself included. I told him I needed to see his credentials. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me an ID card without argument. I examined it under my flashlight. The badge had our company logo on it almost. The typeface was slightly off, the background a shade darker. The name read, Marcus Hale, signal technician, and the photograph matched the man in front of me. But the ID number format was wrong. Too many digits, incorrect prefix, and where our current badges carry the company's corporate name. His read the name of a predecessor company that had been absorbed into ours in a merger over 25 years ago. This company doesn't exist anymore, I said. I know, he said. He said it without apology or explanation, and the quietness of it stopped me from pressing further. I turned to the fault he described. Terminal block 4, binding screw, he was exactly right. A textbook vibration fault, the kind that develops slowly on heavily trafficked stretches of line. I had it isolated and corrected in 12 minutes. While I worked, Marcus sat without moving and watched me with an expression I found difficult to categorize, not threatening, not vacant, something closer to the way a person looks when they're carrying something heavy and have been carrying it for a very long time. When I finished and turned around, he said, You transferred to this district from the southern section, didn't you? About 8 years ago. I looked at him. That's right. You transferred because of your daughter, he said. She was sick. You needed to be closer to the hospital where she was being treated. I felt the flashlight go cold in my hand. How do you know that? I said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his folded hands, then back at me. I've been paying attention for a long time, he said. To who comes through here, to who works this district. You've been here 8 years, and you're the first person I've spoken to, the first person who's been alone up here long enough to listen. My daughter is not something that goes in a personnel file, I said. My voice was steady, but only barely. Her illness was a private matter. I never disclosed it to my employer. I know you didn't, he said. The storm outside had gone from severe to something worse. I could hear the wind working itself against the steel walls in sustained gusts, and twice the building shuddered hard enough to make the relay racks rattle. I tried Dale on the radio and got broken static. My phone had no signal. It hadn't since the 4th mile of the access road. I wasn't going anywhere. I sat on the equipment case and looked at this man and tried to think clearly. He knew the access code. He knew the fault. He knew the name of a predecessor company that an ordinary person wouldn't have reason to know. He knew something about my personal life that I had never written down, never disclosed, and that was not contained in any database I could think of. His badge was from a company that dissolved before half our current staff was born. Tell me why you're here, I said. He told me, steadily and without drama, the way someone tells a story they've told many times in their head and finally get to say out loud. In February of 1981, there had been an accident on this stretch of track. A freight train had struck a crew truck at a grade crossing approximately a quarter mile north of Station 7. 2 men were killed. One of them was Marcus's partner, Arthur Kemper, who had been working on the crossing signal alone for 6 hours, attempting to isolate a relay fault. Marcus had been up at the station running communication tests. When he came back down the access road, he found the truck. He found Arthur. The investigation attributed the accident to equipment failure caused by deferred maintenance. Specifically, it concluded that Arthur had failed to correctly repair the crossing relay and that this negligence had caused the signal to malfunction and failed to halt the train. Arthur's service record was amended. His family, a widow and 2 daughters, received a reduced settlement because of the negligence finding. That finding was wrong, Marcus said. Arthur repaired the relay correctly. I know because I inspected his work before I went up to the station. The fault was upstream in the main line signal controller. The company knew that. If the investigation had concluded correctly, it would have meant they'd deferred critical maintenance on 6 crossing signal systems in the district. They would have been liable at a level they couldn't absorb. He paused. So they didn't conclude correctly. He told me he had filed a supplemental investigation report. He had documented Arthur's correct repair work, noted the upstream fault, and submitted it through proper channels. That report was never entered into the formal record. When he attempted to escalate it, he was told the investigation was closed. When he requested confirmation that his report had been received, he was given a reference number that didn't correspond to any file he could locate. I know where the physical record is, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, heavy stock, slightly yellowed, handwritten in a careful, deliberate hand. He held it out to me. I took it. A records facility address, a filing reference number, a date at the top of the page, February 14th, 1981, 9 days after the accident. Why can't you retrieve it yourself? I said. He looked at me for a long time, longer than was comfortable. Then he said, I've tried, more times than I can count. Something always goes wrong. He said it as though it were a simple logistical problem, as though he were describing a shipping delay. We didn't talk much after that. The hours passed slowly. I rationed my flashlight and mostly sat in the dark listening to the storm. Marcus's flashlight remained off the entire time. I didn't see him eat or drink. Once I offered him coffee from my thermos and he declined politely. Once I asked if the cold was getting to him, he said no, and I noticed, not for the first time, that I couldn't see his breath. The temperature inside a station like that will drop through the night. You can always see your breath. I must have fallen asleep somewhere around midnight. I was sitting against the equipment rack with my jacket doubled around my shoulders and the paper still in my hand. The last thing I remember before sleep was Marcus sitting in the folding chair across from me, watching the door. When I woke, faint grey light was coming in under the door, and the station was completely silent. Marcus was gone. The folding chair was folded back flush against the wall, exactly as it had been when I'd arrived. There was nothing to indicate it had ever been occupied. I opened the station door. The storm had passed. Fresh snow, deep and undisturbed, blanketed everything. The access road was smooth and white all the way to the tree line. There were no tracks leading away from the station. There were no tracks of any kind in the snow around the building except mine leading from my truck to the door. Just mine. I stood there in the silence for a long time, not moving. Then I looked down at my hand. The paper was still there, folded, yellowed, filled with Marcus Hale's careful handwriting. Dale met me at the highway around 8:30 a.m. He'd arranged a plow and was visibly relieved to see me and visibly alarmed by the state of me. He sent me directly to urgent care, mild hypothermia. They kept me for observation. I didn't mention Marcus. 3 weeks later, back at work, I spent a weekend pulling old regional newspaper records from the state library database. The 1981 accident wasn't hard to find a brief notice in a local paper, the kind of 2-paragraph item that industrial accidents generated in those days. 2 fatalities, a freight crossing incident, a grade crossing on a stretch of mountain rail line in the Pacific Northwest. Both victims were named. The first was Arthur Kemper, maintenance technician, survived by his wife and 2 daughters. The second was Marcus Hale, signal and communications technician, aged 28. I've done the math. He told me he started working the district in 1974 at 23 years old. 23 in 1974 puts him at 28 in February of 1981. The age matches, the name matches. The company he worked for, the one printed on his badge, matches the predecessor company that was absorbed into ours years after the accident. I still have the paper he gave me. The records facility he mentioned exists. I looked it up. I haven't called yet. I've been trying to decide what I would do with whatever I found, and whether I'm ready to find out whether the file is actually there. But I think about Arthur Kemper's daughters. They would be in their 60s now. They spent their entire lives with their father's name attached to a finding of negligence he apparently didn't deserve. With a settlement their mother received on reduced terms because the investigation concluded he had failed at his job. I think Marcus Hale spent 40 years trying to reach someone who would listen long enough to do something about it. I was alone in a station in a blizzard with nowhere to go and all the time in the world. I'm going to make that call. I think it's the least I can do. We continue. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 25 years old, and until about 8 months ago, I worked the overnight shift at a self-storage facility on the east side of Greensboro, North Carolina. The place was called Anchor Point Storage, which I always thought was a strange name for a business that essentially sold people the right to forget things in a locked box, but that was none of my concern. The pay was steady, the hours didn't overlap with my classes at Guilford Technical, and the work was quiet enough that I could spread my textbooks across the counter and study for 3 or 4 hours every shift without anyone noticing. I'm working toward a degree in electrical engineering. My father was an electrician for 30 years, and he always said the work was honest, that you showed up, you did the job, you left behind something that worked. I liked that idea. I liked the clarity of it. Most nights at Anchor Point, I thought about circuits and load calculations while the security monitors flickered in front of me, and I drank bad coffee from a machine we kept on a shelf beside the door, and I waited for 6 in the morning. The facility had 3 blocks of units A, B, and C, arranged along concrete corridors behind a chain-link fence. Block C was the farthest from the front office, separated from the others by a long, uncovered passage with overhead fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered at irregular intervals. When I started the job, I asked my supervisor, a heavy-set man named Derek who came in at 6 to relieve me, whether maintenance had looked at those lights. He told me they'd been like that for at least 2 years and that the work order had been submitted so many times it had become a running joke among the daytime staff. I stopped asking after that. I walked the property twice a night, once at midnight and once at 4 in the morning, and those walks through Block C were the only part of the job that made me uneasy. Not in any way I could explain. Just an ambient discomfort, the kind you dismiss because you're a practical person and you know that old buildings make strange noises and that fluorescent bulbs flicker when the ballasts fail and that your mind will find patterns in random things if you give it the chance. I was a practical person. I believed in explanations. I still want to believe in them. This happened on a Tuesday night in February during the second month of the new year, when the cold in Greensboro was wet and mean and the kind that settles into your joints. It had rained earlier that evening, and the concrete throughout the facility was still slick and dark under the security lights, reflecting everything in shallow orange pools. I had my physics notes out on the counter. I had just finished a cup of coffee. It was 12 minutes past 1 in the morning. I heard the truck before I saw it. An old engine, the kind that labors a little on cold nights, turning over with effort and with something uneven in it, like a small hesitation before each cycle. The headlights swept across the booth window and I leaned forward toward the cameras before buzzing him through. The entrance camera showed a dark green pickup, late 80s, early 90s at most. The front windshield had a long crack running from the driver's side diagonally across to the middle, sealed with a line of transparent tape that had started to peel at one edge. I pulled up his account when the access card registered. Walter Greer, Unit 147, Block C. His account had been active for 11 years, the oldest continuous rental in the facility at that time. Auto-drafted monthly, no late payments, no complaints, no notes from any previous employee. I had never seen his name on a night access log. In 4 months of overnight shifts, Walter Greer had never once come in after dark. Most tenants who access their units late at night have a clear, practical purpose. They work irregular hours, they need something specific, a piece of camping equipment, a set of boxes before a move, and they're in and out in under 10 minutes. They almost never stop at the office. Walter Greer stopped at the office. He knocked on the glass with 2 knuckles. I slid the window open. The cold came in immediately. He was old, 70, perhaps 75, the kind of age where it becomes difficult to be precise. He had thick white hair combed back neatly, still holding its shape despite the hour and the weather. His coat was dark wool, good quality from years ago, worn now at the elbows and along the lapels where fabric gets handled over and over. His eyes were pale gray, the color of overcast sky, and they were composed, not nervous in an obvious way, but holding something behind the composure. The way a person's face looks when they've made a difficult decision and are committed to it. You're the one working tonight? He asked. Yes, sir, Nathan. Is everything all right? He glanced toward the back of the facility. Past Block A, past Block B, toward the lights at the far end that were doing their usual slow pulsing flicker. I need to get into my unit, he said. I know it's late, I won't take long. Of course, sir. That's what the access hours are for. Do you need anything? A cart? A hand truck? No cart. A pause. I may need you to walk back there with me. I know that's unusual. I'll compensate you for your time. I want to be honest. I should have declined. The company had a clear policy about employees entering tenant spaces, and a good policy it was. For liability reasons, I understood completely. But there was something in the way Walter Greer said it that made the refusal seem wrong. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't odd in the way that makes a person step back and reassess the situation. He was asking the way a person asks for a small, reasonable kindness, and the way someone holds a door open for a stranger and hopes the stranger will accept the gesture without making it complicated. I think I can step away from the desk for a bit, I said. It's a quiet night. He thanked me without smiling, the way a person thanks you when they're relieved rather than pleased. We walked the main corridor together without much conversation. He moved slowly but steadily, both hands in his coat pockets. When we turned into the passage that led to Block C, I noticed the cold change. It wasn't just the February air, there was a quality to it near Block C that I had registered before on my nightly walks, but had always attributed to the drainage channel that ran behind the fence at the far end, moisture rising from concrete, something structural. Standing in it now with another person, I noticed it differently. It came from the ground. It rose from below the concrete rather than descending from the air. I noticed the smell a moment later. It came on gradually, the way a smell does when you're walking toward its source. Old paper at first dry and faintly sweet, which was natural enough in a place full of stored boxes and sealed containers. But underneath that was something else, something that took me a moment to place. The smell you get from an air vent that hasn't circulated in years. Sealed iron, old heat, dust that has compressed itself into something almost solid. The smell of space that has been closed off from breathing air for a very long time. Walter stopped in front of Unit 147. He took a small key from his coat pocket and removed the padlock. He rolled the metal door up slowly. It made the sound that all storage unit doors make, a mechanical groan rising through a series of clanks, and then the unit was open. He reached inside for the pull chain. A single bare bulb came on and threw hard shadows across the contents of the unit. It had been organized carefully once, and the organization still held mostly. Moving blankets covered the larger pieces of furniture. Plastic tubs were stacked in even rows along both walls, labeled in a small handwriting that was precise and slightly old-fashioned in its lettering. Boxes sealed with brown tape, the possessions of a life sorted and numbered and tucked away. The smell was stronger inside, noticeably so, and the temperature had dropped another degree or two since we crossed the threshold. At the back of the unit, against the far wall, stood a wooden cabinet. Dark wood, substantial, with 2 doors above 3 drawers. Everything else in the unit had been covered and protected. The cabinet stood bare. Walter looked at it from just inside the doorway and didn't move toward it. My daughters, he said. He said it the way people say things they've said many times, when the words have become separate from the feeling that originally produced them. Eleanor, she died 10 years ago in November. Car accident going west on 70. She was 31 years old. I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. I couldn't keep her things in the house afterward. I couldn't walk past them, but I couldn't give them away either, so I brought them here. He kept his eyes on the cabinet. I paid the fees every month. I thought eventually I'd know what to do with it all. That's what I told myself. He moved slightly closer to the cabinet and stopped again, about 4 feet from it. Something changed last month, he said. I came to pull a specific box. I had some paperwork to deal with, charitable donation records, and I heard something from inside the cabinet, not from the unit, from inside the cabinet itself. He paused. I don't mean a mouse, I don't mean the building. I've heard those things. This was different. It was deliberate. The bulb overhead flickered once, a brief dimming and return, and the shadows at the back of the unit shifted and settled. I came back 3 days after that, Walter continued. I had my late wife's Bible with me. I stood outside the door and I prayed. Then I came in. The smell was here, same as now, but worse, much worse. Whatever I'd heard the time before, I could feel it. That's the word I keep coming back to. I could feel it the way you feel pressure change before a storm. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd entered the unit. I'm not going to tell you what I think is in that cabinet, he said. I spent 73 years believing that everything has an explanation, and I'd like to keep believing that if I can. What I know from experience is simpler than that. Grief is heavy. When you seal it in a small room for 10 years and never deal with it, it doesn't sit still. It becomes something. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small glass jar, the kind that holds preserves filled with a dark granular substance. Not salt. It was darker than salt, with flecks of something pale through it. His hands were steady. I need you to open the cabinet doors, he said, both of them at the same time. Don't reach inside. Don't touch anything. Just open them, step back, and let me do what I need to do. I stood at the cabinet and put my hands on the brass handles, which were tarnished to the color of old pennies and cold to the touch, colder than the air in the room. I waited for Walter to tell me when. The silence in the unit was not empty. That's the thing I've come back to most in the months since. There was a quality to the quiet that was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something that was not making noise, like being in a room with someone who is holding very still. Now, Walter said. I pulled both doors open. The smell that came out was different from the smell in the room. It was lavender and cedar, the compressed smell of folded cloth and closed drawers, Eleanor's smell, or what I imagined it to be. The upper shelf held sweaters, folded carefully. The lower shelf had books upright in a short row, and leaning against them, a small silver-framed photograph face down. A jewelry box with a painted design on the lid sat in the corner of the lower shelf, and at the back of the cabinet, in the gap between the rear edge of the shelves and the interior wall, there was darkness that didn't respond to the light the way it should. The bulb threw light across everything in the unit except that gap. The light stopped at its edge. I'm an engineering student. I know how light works. I am telling you what I observed. I stepped back. I don't remember deciding to. My body made the decision. Walter moved forward with the jar and began working his way around the interior frame of the cabinet, sprinkling the contents along the top, the sides, the interior corners. He spoke while he worked, under his breath, too low for me to make out words, but with a cadence that was rhythmic and unhurried, a prayer, or something like one, repeated and held in the muscle memory of his lips. The smell in the room changed while he did this. The deep metallic note in it faded slowly, like a sound being turned down. Somewhere outside the unit in Block B, or perhaps in the corridor between them, something fell, a heavy sound, a single impact, like something large sliding off a shelf. Then nothing. Walter finished. He stood back from the cabinet and was very still for a moment, his eyes closed, one hand resting flat on the wooden doorframe. Then his shoulders dropped just slightly, the release of something he'd been holding, and he turned to me. There's a photograph on the lower shelf, he said, in a silver frame. I'd like you to take it out, not to keep, just carry it out of here. I'll get it from you when we're outside. I crouched and picked up the frame from the lower shelf. I turned it over. A young woman with dark hair and her father's gray eyes standing beside a younger Walter in a park somewhere in summer. His hand was on her shoulder. Her own hand was raised and slightly blurred, caught mid-gesture by the camera. She was almost smiling, or had just finished smiling, or was about to. The photograph had caught her in the moment between. I held the frame against my chest and straightened up. Walter stepped forward, closed both doors of the cabinet, and pressed his palms flat against the wood. He held them there without moving. Whatever he was doing or saying in the silence of that, I didn't interrupt it. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then he let go. All right, he said, let's go. We walked out of the unit. He pulled the metal door back down to the concrete and locked the padlock. He didn't look at the door after he locked it. We turned and walked back up the corridor. We were halfway to the main passage when I heard it. Behind us, inside Unit 147, something moved. It was not loud, it was not violent, it was the sound of weight shifting slowly, something adjusting its position in a confined space, like furniture being rearranged by careful hands, like something that had been pressed against a wall for a long time, taking a slow step forward or backward or sideways into a different part of the room. I did not look back. Walter did not look back. We kept walking, and our footsteps were the only sound in Block C, and neither of us spoke until we were standing in front of the booth. I passed the photograph through the window slot. Walter took it in both hands and held it under the fluorescent light. He looked at it for a long time. She was afraid of the dark when she was little, he said. From about age 4 until she was 7 or 8. I used to sit in the chair beside her bed until she fell asleep. Every night, I didn't mind it. He paused. I put everything she owned in a dark room and left it there for 10 years. I've thought about that. He tucked the photograph into his coat pocket, buttoned it closed. Someone will come for the rest of it, he said. Her clothes, her books. There are people who can use those things. Eleanor was practical. She gave things away her whole life. She didn't hold on to what she wasn't using. She would have told me to do this a long time ago. And she would have been right. He said goodnight. He got back into the old green truck, and the engine turned over with the same labored patience it had arrived with. He pulled out of the entrance lane and turned left on the main road, and the sound of him faded with the distance, and then the night was quiet again. I went back into the booth and sat in front of the monitors. I watched the Block C camera for the rest of the shift, 4 hours and 40-something minutes, and nothing moved. The lights out there kept their flickering rhythm, the same as always, nothing in the corridor, nothing near Unit 147. When Derek came in at 6, I filed the night log and put my coat on and walked once more through the property on my way to my car. In the early light, Block C was just concrete and metal and chain link. Unit 147 was padlocked and still. 3 months later, I left Anchor Point for a better job with better hours. I gave notice properly, worked my last shift, and didn't go back. Sometime after that, on a separate matter, a paycheck discrepancy, something minor, I called the facility manager, and while I had him on the line, asked whether Unit 147 had cleared out. He looked it up. He told me it had been settled in April. He said a woman had come with a notarized document authorizing the removal of the contents. The account name on file was Eleanor Greer. He'd assumed it was a family member, an adult child maybe, or a niece because the woman who came was young. Late 20s, he said. He hadn't asked questions. The unit had been cleaned out and re-rented. I didn't say anything to that. There was no sensible thing to say. I think about Walter Greer on certain nights, usually when I'm studying late and the building around me is quiet and the overhead light is doing what overhead lights sometimes do, which is to cast a shadow in a corner that doesn't quite correspond to anything in the room. I think about what he said, grief is heavier, and when you keep it in a small room for 10 years and never deal with it, it becomes something. I believe him. I believed him then. I'm not sure what I believe about the rest of it, but I keep a light on when I sleep now. I started doing that the week after the night in Block C, and I've tried to stop a few times, and I haven't managed to. And I've decided I'm not going to force the issue. Some things you don't have to understand to carry with you. We continue. I don't know how to begin this properly. People always say start at the beginning, but when I try to find where the beginning actually is, I keep landing in the same place not 6 years ago, on an empty stretch of highway in East Texas, not the motel room in Van Horn, where I spent a whole night sitting in my truck in a parking lot, unable to explain what I'd seen in the bathroom. I keep landing 18 years back in the middle of a February night, watching my sister Diane walk back into a burning house. That's where it starts. That's where everything starts. I was 12 years old. Diane was 16. We lived in a wood frame house outside of Jasper, Texas, my parents Diane and me. Nothing about that house was remarkable. Weathered porch boards, a rusted propane tank out back, a pecan tree in the front yard that shed enough nuts every fall to fill 2 garbage bags. Ordinary. The kind of house that holds a family together across years without incident, and then one night simply decides it's done. The fire started in the laundry room. A faulty dryer vent and some rags my father had left folded on top of the machine. That was the fire investigator's conclusion anyway. I woke up choking and disoriented, smoke already thick in the hallway. My father got my mother out through their bedroom window. I followed them. We stood together in the cold dark of the front yard, barefoot in the frost-hardened grass, watching orange light pulse behind the back windows of the house. And it was only then that my father realized Diane wasn't with us. He started screaming her name. He was about to go back in when the front door banged open. Diane came out. She was coughing hard, one arm raised to cover her face, her pajamas gray with soot, but she came out. My mother ran to her and pulled her close, and for about 10 seconds I felt a specific kind of relief that I have never felt before or since. The deep body relief that comes when you realize the worst thing hasn't happened. Then Diane pulled back and said, still coughing, "Pepper is still inside." Pepper was our beagle. He'd been my father's dog before I was born. Old and thick around the middle and half deaf, the kind of dog that sleeps through thunderstorms and gets underfoot in the kitchen. He slept on a folded blanket near the stove. "No," my father said. He grabbed her arm. "Diane, no." But she was already moving. She went back to the front door before any of us could close the distance. My father tried to follow her. My mother pulled him back. I just stood there, 12 years old, and unable to make my legs do anything at all. The fire department arrived just under 5 minutes later. They went in. They came out first with Pepper badly burned but alive, though he only survived another month before my father made the decision no one wanted to make. They came out with Pepper and then they came out with Diane. She had found the dog under the kitchen table and was heading back toward the front when a section of the ceiling came down. The fire investigator said it was fast. He said that with the careful gentleness of a man who has delivered this kind of information many times. I don't know whether it was a mercy. I know it didn't feel like one. I want to tell you about Diane before I go further because this matters. She was the kind of person who made a room feel more organized just by walking into it. Not because she was rigid, she wasn't, but because she paid attention. She remembered things, your bad week at school, what song you mentioned offhand 2 months ago that she'd then downloaded for you without telling you. She had a way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was worth saying. I've met very few people in my adult life who listened the way Diane did, and I've been looking whether I knew it or not. On her nightstand, she kept a music box that had belonged to our grandmother, our mother's mother Frances, who'd brought it from Alabama when she married and never mentioned where it had come from before that. The box was made of dark, polished wood with a cream-colored lid hand-painted with clusters of morning glories. When you lifted the lid, a few delicate measures of Beautiful Dreamer would play thin, wavering, mechanical, the kind of sound that carries immediately back to whatever room you first heard it in. Diane had asked for that box the day Grandma Frances was buried, and she kept it on her nightstand every night for as long as I could remember. The music box burned with the house, with Diane. There was nothing left of her room but charred timber and ash. After the fire, my family did what families do when the worst has happened. They went quiet in different ways. My father stopped drinking, not out of virtue, but because something in him switched off that night and never switched back on. My mother filled every hour with church activity, charity work, casseroles for neighbors, Bible study, anything that kept the silence from catching up with her. I fell through the gap between them and gradually found my own way to disappear. I became a long-haul trucker at 24. I'm not going to romanticize it. It was work that suited a person who needed to keep moving and didn't require him to stay in one place long enough to sit with himself. I ran the I-10 corridor, mostly Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, occasionally into Arizona. My dispatcher was a heavy-set man named Carl who wore the same Texans cap every time I saw him in person, and told me once, on a slow afternoon, that I was his most reliable driver. I appreciated that. It felt like a fact about me that I could hold on to. For 5 years I drove and I delivered and I slept in truck stop motels and I kept Diane in the locked compartment where I kept everything I wasn't ready to look at. Nothing strange happened. Then something did. The night on Highway 20 was late October, about 6 years ago. I was westbound, 30 miles east of Shreveport, running empty after a delivery in Monroe. Midnight, clear sky. The road was almost empty in both directions and I had a sports talk station out of Dallas murmuring in the background. I want to be clear that I was awake, not drowsy. I'd slept the night before, driven through the morning, and I was alert the way you get alert on late empty roads when you have nothing to think about but the road. Something was sitting in the right lane ahead of me. I couldn't make it out at first, just a dark shape low to the asphalt, maybe 300 yards out. I slowed and hit my high beams. As I rolled forward, the object sharpened in my headlights. It was a music box, sitting perfectly upright in the lane, dark wood, cream-colored top with painted morning glories. I pulled onto the shoulder and cut the engine and sat for a long time with my hazards blinking, staring at it through the windshield. There was no vehicle nearby, no sign of an accident, no shoulder debris, nothing to explain how a music box ended up sitting in the middle of a 2-lane Texas highway after midnight. I thought, you're overworked, you're pattern matching. Your brain sees something and tells you it's something it isn't. That happens on long runs. You see a bundle of lumber tarps and your nervous system tells you it's an animal. You look at shadows and find shapes. The mind does that. I got out of the cab anyway. The night was warm and smelled like pine and fresh tar. frogs going in the trees off the shoulder. I walked up to the object slowly, crouched down in front of it. The morning glories on the lid were rendered in pale blue and violet against the cream paint exactly as I remembered. Exactly, not similar, not a resemblance. I have turned this over in my mind hundreds of times in the years since, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. It was the same music box. I didn't touch it. I don't know why I didn't touch it. I stood up, walked back to the cab, and pulled back onto the highway. I watched it in my mirrors until a curve in the road took it from view. 50 miles later, my phone rang. My mother's number. "Marcus," she said. "Honey, I need to tell you something about Devin." I should explain about my cousin Devin. He was 15 when the fire happened, staying with us that week, sleeping on the living room couch. He'd been one of the first of us out of the house that night. He was standing in the yard when Diane went back inside. He'd never been entirely the same after that. Not in a way that got him hospitalized. Not then, but quieter, more watchful. He'd blink sometimes in the middle of a conversation and come back from wherever he'd gone. I tried to bring it up once years later when we were both adults and sitting in his truck outside a bar in Beaumont. He'd looked at me with an expression I couldn't classify and said, "I saw something standing near the door, Marcus, right before she went back in. I don't know what it was. I've never told anyone because I didn't know how to say it. I hadn't asked him to say more. I told myself it was because I didn't want to push him. The truth is, I was afraid of the answer. Now my mother was telling me he'd been found unresponsive in his apartment. His roommate had come home to find him sitting completely still in his closet with the door pulled shut, and Devin hadn't responded to his name, hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. They'd called an ambulance. He was admitted to a psychiatric unit in Beaumont that night. His roommate told us afterward that for the 3 or 4 weeks before, Devin had been deteriorating, not sleeping, barely eating, saying he kept seeing shapes in the corners of rooms, figures reflected in windows that weren't there when he turned to look. I drove the rest of the way to Shreveport in silence. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen on the highway. I told myself it was a coincidence, that the music box had been some random discarded object that my grief-shaped brain had turned into something else, and that Devin's breakdown and my mother's phone call coming within an hour of each other meant nothing. Grief manufactures connections. I know that. I've read about it. I almost convinced myself. Devin was in the hospital for 6 weeks. When he came out, he was calmer but hollowed, thinner, careful with his words, medicated. He moved back to his mother's house, my Aunt Lorraine, and spent months doing almost nothing. 4 months after Highway 20, I was on an overnight run to El Paso. I stopped in Van Horn around 11, one of those motels with parking lots that smell like motor oil and rooms that smell like aggressive bleach doing its best to cover other things. I showered, turned on the television, and lay on top of the covers in my work clothes. I wasn't planning to sleep, just to rest for a few hours before the last stretch. I heard music, faint, mechanical, coming from behind the closed bathroom door. I turned the TV down and sat up. The sound clarified. It was Beautiful Dreamer playing in short, looping measures, the kind of loop a music box makes when you just wound it and left the lid up. I know that sound the way I know my own voice. I have been hearing it in my dreams since I was old enough to walk down the hall to my sister's room at night. I went to the bathroom door and stood with my hand on the handle for a moment. Then I opened it. The music box was sitting on the edge of the sink, open. The small mechanical arm turning against the metal comb inside, sending those thin notes into the tiled air. I have no explanation for how it got there. The bathroom had been empty when I'd showered 40 minutes earlier. The room door was locked. I don't have an explanation, and I gave up trying to find one somewhere around the 3rd year of thinking about it. The room smelled like smoke. That's the other thing. Not cigarette smoke, not chemical smoke, wood smoke, the specific smell of a house fire. And beneath it, something older and harder to name. I have smelled it twice in my life, that night, and in the woods near our house the morning after the fire, when my father and I walked the perimeter together while my mother sat inside, unable to look at the foundation. I backed out of the bathroom. I left the motel room, sat in my truck, and watched the sky lighten from black to gray to the flat white of a West Texas dawn. I drove to El Paso without stopping. When I came back from that run, I drove straight to Aunt Lorraine's house. Devin was sitting on the porch with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at nothing in particular. He looked like a man conserving energy. When I came up the walk, he looked at me and didn't say hello. He said, "You've seen it too." We sat on that porch for 2 hours. He told me what he'd seen the night of the fire, not just a shape by the door, but something he described as a darkness that moved independently of the shadows around it. A tall form, approximately human in proportion, standing near the burning door frame. He said it had no face, but that he'd had the specific and immediate sensation of being seen by it. He said it had been looking at all of them, at my mother, my father, him, and then Diane went back inside. It didn't go in after her, Devin said. It was already inside. He believed it had never left, that it had followed the family ever since, patient and unhurried, surfacing occasionally to remind us it was there. He said it showed him the fire every night when he slept. He said it showed him Diane at the door, turning back to look at him before she disappeared into the smoke. I asked him why he thought it was doing any of this, what it wanted. He wrapped both hands tighter around his mug and didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, I think it feeds on the wound, not us, the grief itself, and ours never closed. 3 weeks later, I came home from a regional run to find my mother sitting on my sofa. She'd driven 4 hours from Jasper without calling, which she hadn't done in years. I covered her with a blanket and let her sleep. Around 2 a.m, I heard movement in the kitchen, and then the back door, and I got up. She was in the backyard, standing barefoot in the grass in her nightgown, facing the back fence, swaying very slightly. The way you sway when you're holding something you're trying to rock to sleep. I called her name. She didn't answer. I walked to her and put my hand on her shoulder, and she turned to look at me. Her eyes were open and completely blank. She was holding the music box. It was cradled against her chest in both hands, the lid closed. I took it from her gently, and she let me without resistance. The wood was cold, not just cool, but deeply cold. The cold of something that has been somewhere with no warmth at all for a very long time. I walked her back inside, made tea, sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched the awareness return to her face in stages, the way light comes back into a room when someone raises the blind slowly. She didn't know she'd been outside. She didn't know how long she'd been standing there. She'd been dreaming about Diane. She said in the dream Diane was walking back toward the burning house the way she had that night, and my mother was running after her, trying to grab her, calling her name. And in the dream, standing near the doorframe in the smoke, there was a tall, dark shape that had no face, and as my mother reached for Diane, the shape had turned toward her instead. It had Diane's face, my mother said, holding her mug with both hands. For just a second, then it didn't anymore. I went outside to retrieve the music box from the grass where I'd left it. There was nothing there. That was 14 months ago. I have not seen the music box since. My mother is still in Jasper. She goes to her church and fills her days, and when I call on Sunday evening, she sounds like herself, which is most of what I can ask for. Devin is working again. He got a job at a hardware store in Beaumont, and when I see him, which is maybe twice a year, he seems close to ordinary. He still won't talk about the fire. I've stopped bringing it up. I don't have a framework that comfortably holds what I've described. I've tried several. I've sat with a pastor, with a counselor, with a man Aunt Lorraine knows who does something she calls spiritual clearing, though I'm not sure what I'd call it, and none of them gave me an explanation I can stand all the way inside of. What I've come to believe is this. There are presences that attach themselves to grief, not to us exactly, but to the wound that grief opens and that we don't always know how to close. My family had been carrying the wound of Diane's death for nearly 2 decades, and none of us had tended to it properly. We'd locked it in compartments. My father's silence, my mother's endless busyness, my endless miles of highway. We'd all found ways to keep moving so we wouldn't have to stop and face it. Whatever found us, whatever it was standing by that burning doorway, on the night Devin saw it, I think it moved through the open wound the way cold air moves through a gap in a wall. It showed us what hurt us most, and it showed us without mercy the music box, the fire, Diane at the door always turning back. I don't know what made it stop. I don't know whether something Aunt Lorraine did in her house with candles and prayers on a Thursday afternoon did something I'll never be able to measure or verify. I don't know whether it simply got what it came for and moved on. I don't know whether it's still out there somewhere on Highway 20 or in the dark of a motel bathroom waiting for someone else who's carrying a wound they haven't learned to look at. I know that I drive differently now, not worse. I still do my runs, still move the cargo, still log my hours. But I drive with the window cracked and the radio off more often than I used to, and when the road gets long and empty and the night comes in around me, I let myself think about Diane, not with the locked compartment feeling, with the door open, she was 16 years old and she walked back into a burning building for an old dog because she loved him and she couldn't help herself. That is the whole of the story of who she was. I spent 18 years turning it into something I couldn't look at directly, and something found that shadow and made itself at home inside it. I think about her clearly now, the way she listened. The morning glories on a small wooden box. A few measures of Beautiful Dreamer playing in a quiet room at night. I hope wherever she is, it's somewhere that has no fire, something cool and unhurried, a front porch and a pecan tree and a music box on a nightstand playing the same few notes over and over the way the best things do.